They say a father's love is eternal. But what happens when that love is swallowed whole by fear, suspicion, and madness? In the frozen heart of 16th century Russia, a boy was crowned a Tsar before he could spell the word mercy. He would become a man of absolute power, a ruler anointed by God, feared by all, and haunted by ghosts no priest could exorcise. This is not a legend. This is not a fairy tale. This is the true story of Ivan IV, the Tsar who crowned himself above all men and struck down his own son with his bare hands. And if you think you know how this story ends, you don't. The bells of Moscow rang not for joy, but for silence. It was the year 1533, and winter had barely loosened its grip on the earth when Grand Prince Vasily III of Russia breathed his last. His passing was not mourned with weeping, with wary glances and hushed prayers, because he left behind a boy of merely 3 years old, one who would grow to cast the longest shadow Russia had ever known. His name was Ivan, and from the moment he toddled across the blood-polished floors of the Kremlin, his fate was no longer his own. Imagine it, a vast palace of stone and whispers, cold corridors where power prowled like a beast unseen. Ivan's mother, Alina Glinskaya, briefly ruled as regent, but poison, like a snake in her chalice, silenced her only 5 years later. And so the boy became an orphan. But more than that, a child emperor, sovereign of all Russia, yet subject to none but fear. Those early years are cloaked in silence. But let us imagine, shall we? A small child wandering beneath vaulted ceilings too vast for his voice to echo back. Courtiers with eyes like daggers, bojars drunk on inherited power. And in the corners of shadowed rooms, servants whispering his name with dread. Ivan. Ivanushka, the little Tsar. They beat him. Yes. Not with rods, but with hunger and neglect. They left him in cold chambers with dead animals to amuse him. They took everything but his mind, and that his mind grew sharp, monstrous, and alone, like a candle left burning in an empty crypt. He watched as noblemen schemed, poisoned one another, and clawed for power with fingers crusted in gold. They treated him not as ruler, but as a puppet child too small to see the strings. But Ivan saw. He always saw, and each betrayal, each slap, each whispered insult fermented in the wine barrel of his soul. By the time he reached 16, he had learned not just to read, he had learned to hate. And when the time came for his coronation, he did something no Russian prince had dared before. He crowned himself Tsar, not Grand Prince, not ruler by noble decree, but Tsar Caesarean Emperor, appointed by God and unanswerable to man. The coronation was no mere ceremony. It was a resurrection. The child was dead. In his place stood Ivan IV, crowned not in gold, but in vengeance. Cloaked not in velvet, but the ghosts of his childhood. And as the incense rose above the cathedral, mingling with chants and candlelight, there was something else in the air. Something colder, like the prelude to a storm that would soak the soil of Russia in blood. He married Anastasia Romanovna, a woman of gentle grace, and for a time, just a breath in eternity, he knew peace. With her beside him, his wrath softened. His policies, though ruthless, bore the fruit of reform. A new legal code. A standing army, centralized power wrested from the claws of the boyars. Russia began to rise, though her foundations trembled. But peace, as history shows us, is a borrowed garment. It never fits the shoulders of those born for war. And when Anastasia fell ill and died, perhaps poisoned, as Ivan would come to believe, he unraveled. Not like a man in mourning, but like a god betrayed. He screamed at the heavens. He raged at his counselors. He struck down nobles in fits of madness. He accused his closest allies of treason. And in that moment, when love left him, so too did the last shred of the boy named Ivan. What followed was not rule. It was reign. And so we begin not with a murder, but with a wound deep as empire. carved in the soul of a child king whose every breath henceforth would echo with suspicion, cruelty, and divine fury. The tragedy had not yet occurred. The son still lived, but the seeds were planted in soil made fertile by blood and betrayal. This is not simply the story of Ivan the Terrible. This is the story of how power, once fed to a starving boy, became a beast with no leash, and how that beast, in time, would devour its own. Grief, when left unburied, does not rot quietly. It becomes something else, something with claws. After Anastasia's death in 1560, Ivan's descent into darkness was not a sudden fall, but a slow and deliberate walk through fire. His pain fermented into paranoia. And paranoia, once crowned, needs no evidence, only whispers. He no longer saw men. He saw traitors, cowards, and ghosts. The boyars, the noble class who had once lorded over his childhood, became the prime suspects in a conspiracy that may have never existed. But to Ivan, suspicion was as real as blood. If he felt it, it was truth. If he dreamt it, it was law. And if he feared it, it had to die. He began retreating from Moscow, vanishing for days into cloisters, dressing as a monk. In private, he would weep, whip himself, confess sins to God and to walls. But when he returned, it was not as a penitent, but as an avenger. And then came the birth of something new, something Russia had never seen before. In 1565, Ivan split his realm into two halves, the Zemshina, governed by the traditional nobility, and the Oprichnina, ruled solely by him and enforced by a new order of black-cloaked riders, the Oprichniki. They were not soldiers, they were shadows. Loyal only to Ivan, dressed in black robes, mounted on black horses. Their saddles often adorned with a severed dog's head and a broom, symbols of their purpose: to sniff out treachery and sweep it from the land. Their loyalty was unquestioning. Their cruelty, unfathomable. With them, Ivan created a state within a state, a realm of divine vengeance where no law existed but his whim. Cities were razed, whole families wiped out in a single breath. Suspected traitors were flayed, boiled, impaled, their remains left to rot in town squares as warnings. Women were raped and mutilated before their husbands' eyes. Children dashed against the Kremlin walls. The Tsar no longer ruled as a man. He had assumed the mask of God's fury, and like all masks, it became his face. And still, he prayed. Each night, Ivan wept before icons, confessing the same sins he would commit again in the morning. His soul split down the middle, half monk, half monster. In public, he recited scripture and quoted St. Augustine. In secret, he ordered executions so gruesome they turned even seasoned killers pale. What does it mean when a ruler believes himself chosen by God, yet feels betrayed by every man? It means that mercy dies. And Russia, under Ivan's hand, became a land where fear was more constant than bread. But there was one thing, one fragile thread, that still tethered Ivan to the world of flesh and love: his son. Ivan Ivanovich. The boy was strong, devout, and painfully loyal to his father. From a young age, he had been raised not as a prince, but as an extension of the Tsar's will. He watched his father with wide, reverent eyes, tried to mimic his movements, his prayers, even his rage. But where the father was born of trauma, the son was born of expectation. He bore a crown made of glass, forever compared to a man who believed himself divine. Still, the boy adored him. Still, he sought only to please. And that is what makes what comes next so impossible to forget. But we are not there yet. Not quite. The blood has not spilled. The chamber is still warm. The son's face still whole. First, we must pass through Novgorod, because before a father could kill his own son, he had to lose the part of himself that was still human. And in the ashes of Novgorod, that final ember would be extinguished. It began with a rumor, not a shout, not a letter sealed in royal wax, just a whisper. That the city of Novgorod, ancient and proud, was plotting treason, that they would open their gates to the Polish king, that they would hand Ivan's crown to foreign hands and smile while doing it. There was no proof, of course, only shadows. But for a man who trusted no light, shadows were all he needed. In January of 1570, Ivan set out for Novgorod with his oprichniki. 5,000 horsemen rode behind him, black-cloaked, expressionless, the hooves of their steeds muffled by the snow. They did not ride like soldiers. They rode like a sentence passed. Novgorod's people, terrified, sent priests and city elders to beg mercy at Ivan's feet. But mercy was not what he had come to offer. He entered the city as if into a tomb, and he would leave it as a butcher. For 5 weeks, Novgorod became hell. The city's bells were silenced, forbidden to toll even for the dead. Streets once filled with chants and trade, now echoed only with screams. Whole families were dragged from their homes, priests, merchants, widows, infants. They were accused of treason, then tortured into confession. The oprichniki turned monasteries into slaughterhouses, their whitewashed walls repainted in blood. Victims were flayed alive, their skin nailed to church doors. Fathers were made to watch their daughters stripped and violated before being beheaded. Others were tied in burlap sacks with dogs and thrown into the icy Volkhov River, beating helplessly against the freezing water until their limbs stopped moving. Some accounts speak of a wooden platform constructed over the river's edge, from which the Tsar himself watched the executions, not with fury, not even with triumph, but with something worse: cold, divine satisfaction, as if he were purging his own kingdom of rot with sacred fire. It said he crossed himself after each body fell. The estimated death toll, over 60,000. Novgorod, once a jewel of medieval Russia, was reduced to smoke and silence. Its churches looted, its archives burned, its people erased. And yet there was no rebellion, no letters exchanged with Poland, no traitorous pact. Novgorod had done nothing, but Ivan's mind, long cracked, had shattered completely. In the eyes of the Tsar, guilt was no longer something proven. It was something felt. If he dreamt your betrayal, it was truth. And once truth had taken shape in his heart, there was no man on earth who could unmake it. After Novgorod, the oprichniki grew bolder, drunk on power and impunity. Villages burned in their path like kindling. Wives of noblemen were raped in front of the icons they prayed to. Priests were drowned with psalms frozen on their lips. But Ivan, he was not merely ruling, he was purging. He believed himself Moses, scourging the idolaters; Christ, casting out the moneylenders; Abraham, raising the knife over Isaac, and yet even Abraham was stopped. But who would stop Ivan? He returned to Moscow a husk of a man, his eyes darker than before, his speech slower, heavier. He took 2 long fasts, days of prayer, and longer nights of rage. He spoke often of demons, of betrayal, of cleansing the earth for his son, his precious Ivan Ivanovich, to inherit. He wanted a legacy. He wanted order, but in seeking it, he created only ash. And the boy watched. He watched his father pray with tears, then murder without pause. He watched his father strike his advisors, accuse loyal men of heresy, torture confessions from monks. He watched, always watched, but never spoke. And inside that silence, something grew. The son would not always obey. He would not always remain the wide-eyed child. One day, he would resist. One day, he would speak. And on that day, blood would touch the royal floor once more. But for now, the Volkhov River still ran red, and the crows of Novgorod circled above the corpses, fat and fearless, as if they knew the worst was yet to come. There is a cruelty more exquisite than death. It is the slow erosion of love beneath the weight of power. And that, more than any dagger or executioner's axe, was what Ivan IV wielded with unmatched precision. He did love his son. That much even his enemies confessed. Ivan Ivanovich was the mirror into which the Tsar dared to look. The boy bore his name, his sharp cheekbones, his volcanic temper, but not his madness. Not yet. From childhood, the young Tsarevich had stood at his father's side like a shadow stitched to his heel. He memorized scripture as Ivan had done, rode with soldiers, studied the politics of court with a desperation to impress. He watched his father sentence men to death and tried to steel himself against horror. Because to be Ivan's son was not merely to be born it, was to be forged. And yet, for all his obedience, he never quite pleased the Tsar. Perhaps it was his kindness. Perhaps it was his idealism. He believed that Russia could be made strong not just through blood, but through structure, law, and purpose. He spoke of lifting the burdens from peasants, of curbing the greed of landowners. He argued for marriage alliances, for diplomacy, instead of constant war. And Ivan his father heard these words like insults wrapped in silk. To Ivan, gentleness was treason. Mercy, a form of pride. Had he not built his reign through fear? Had not fire and blade brought order where nothing else would? The son's ideals, noble though they may have been, struck Ivan as naive, worse dangerous. And yet, there were moments. Moments in candlelit chapels, kneeling together in prayer, where father and son looked not like ruler and heir but like broken men trying to hold each other together. In those rare silences, the Tsar would clutch the boy's hand and whisper, "You must be stronger than me, or they will devour you." It was not a warning. It was a prophecy. Still, tensions grew. The boy grew older, more vocal, more determined. He begged his father to stop the executions, to disband the oprichniki. He pleaded for reforms, for an end to the endless wars that bled Russia dry. Ivan listened dawned, then ordered another raid on a village whose name his son had just spoken in sympathy. The Tsar would test his son as if trying to find the cracks before his enemies did. He humiliated him in public, interrupted him in council, forbade him from taking decisive action. And yet he would later praise him in letters, write him poems, kiss his forehead with trembling lips. To love, for Ivan, was always to wound. But the true divide came not from war, nor politics, nor pride, but from the body of a woman. The Tsarevich had married 3 times, at his father's choosing. 2 wives were sent to convents accused of infertility, of seduction, of treason, by rumor alone. And now, the 3rd, a young girl of noble blood, had grown pregnant at last. The boy was elated. At last, an heir. At last, a future not just for himself, but for Russia. But when Ivan saw her, saw the looseness of her robe, the swell of her belly beneath the folds, something inside him snapped. He called her immodest, accused her of tempting the court with indecent dress. He struck her hard. The blow caused her to miscarry. The son, upon hearing what had happened, ran to his father's chamber, red-faced, sobbing with fury. He screamed, how could he? How could his father do this, again and again? How could he destroy what little hope remained for their bloodline? Ivan IV did not apologize. Instead, he stood, face pale, eyes wide with the storm that always came before the violence. The silence between them was longer than breath, longer than bloodline. And in that silence, something cracked, not in the air, but in the bond between them, not yet broken, but close. The chamber was narrow, gilded with icons, velvet drapes, the faint scent of incense still clinging to the air, like a chapel that had forgotten how to pray. It was there, behind the walls of the Tarim Palace, that father and son met for the final time, as blood and not as enemies. The Tsarevich burst in without ceremony, his voice trembling, not from fear, but from the kind of fury that only love betrayed can produce. His wife, his unborn child, lost, because of a father who had forgotten what mercy was. "You've killed them," he spat, eyes brimming. "My child, your grandchild, you've taken everything." Ivan's eyes flicked toward him, cold, ancient, unmoved. The fury he had once reserved for traitors, foreign kings, and disloyal boyars now turned inward to the blood of his own line. He rose slowly, like a storm lifting from the sea. "She shamed this house," he said quietly. "She flaunted herself like a harlot in the holy courts of Moscow. She was my wife." The boy shouted, "And you struck her. With that same hand you raised to cross yourself before God." There was a moment, thin as glassware silence reigned. Then Ivan moved. He lifted the staff he always carried, its head made of iron, its shaft black as night. His hand did not shake. His breath did not quicken. Perhaps he didn't even know what he was doing. And then the blow fell. A wet crack like the splitting of firewood. Flesh parting. Bone giving way. The Tsarevich fell. Blood spread across the marble, like ink spilled on a sacred page. Ivan stood over him, the staff still trembling in his grasp. And for the first time in years, he truly looked at what he had done. The boy was still breathing. His eyes fluttered, mouth forming shapes with no sound. His skull had caved inward just above the brow. Blood dripped from his nose, from the corners of his mouth, mixing with tears and prayers that never formed into words. And then something extraordinary. Ivan dropped the staff. He fell to his knees beside his son and cradled his head with hands that had ordered thousands to die, but now trembled like a peasant's in winter. "My son," he whispered. "My child, my child." He wept, not as a Tsar, not as God's chosen, but as a father who had killed what he loved most in the world. Servants rushed in, physicians, priests, but nothing could be undone. For days, the Tsarevich lingered between life and death, fevered, silent, unmoving. Ivan remained at his bedside, muttering scripture, clutching at relics, fasting until his lips split and bled. But the boy would not rise. He died within a week. The Tsar did not eat for 3 days. He forbade the court from speaking his name. He struck mirrors from the palace walls, as if to prevent his own eyes from witnessing the truth. The heir of Russia, the only son worthy of the throne, was gone by the hand of the man who had once bathed him as an infant, kissed his forehead as he slept, and whispered to him tales of saints and sacrifice. There would be no more laughter in the Kremlin, no more succession, no future but ruin. And yet the world did not end. The bells of Moscow tolled once more, but this time not in silence. This time they mourned. The palace fell quiet after the boy's death, not the quiet of rest, but the quiet of rot, like a tomb sealed too soon. Courtiers treaded softly, servants spoke in whispers, and no one dared mention the name of the dead. For to speak, it was to touch the raw, open wound at the center of Russia's heart. Ivan changed. Not as tyrants change, hardening, tightening their grip, but as men who have finally broken. He moved through the halls like a ghost, robes dragging, eyes hollow. He still held court, yes. He still signed decrees, ordered executions, dictated scripture to scribes, but his voice no longer carried thunder. It sounded like a prayer half abandoned. He began writing again long, rambling letters to monasteries and foreign rulers. In them, he wept ink. He confessed, he raged, he quoted psalms, then demanded blood. He praised God, then cursed him in the same breath. One letter to Prince Kurbsky, his former friend turned an enemy in exile, simply ended with, "I have killed my son. What then is a kingdom?" There was no answer. The court knew better than to grieve openly. A Tsar who kills his heir does not want pity, he wants silence. But within the chambers of the Kremlin, behind brocade curtains and stone-cold walls, everyone understood. Russia had no future. The only surviving son, Fyodor, was weak, gentle, pious, and intellectually stunted. A boy of prayers and bells, not swords and decrees. Ivan knew it. The boy could not rule. He could barely hold a conversation. He flinched at loud noises. He cried when birds died. And so the throne stood tall, but its shadow was gone. Outside the palace, Russia faltered. The Livonian War, already dragging for decades, drained the treasury dry. Entire regions lay in ruin. Famine stalked the countryside. Towns were deserted, their churches collapsed, their wells poisoned. The oprichniki, now untethered from any meaningful direction, became little more than wolves devouring the very land they were meant to guard. And yet, Ivan did nothing. He sat day after day in his study, sometimes praying, sometimes laughing aloud to no one, sometimes staring at a painting of the Tsarevich, eyes red-rimmed and unmoving for hours. On one occasion, he ordered a feast, set a seat for his son, then struck it over and over with his staff until it broke apart. No one moved. Even the clergy grew uneasy. Whispers rose among the monks. Had the Tsar gone mad? Was his guilt a sickness sent by God or something darker? Legends began to circle like crows around the towers of Moscow. Some claimed Ivan spoke to the dead. Others said he drank mercury, that he saw visions of saints and demons alike. One servant claimed he heard the Tsar scream in the middle of the night, "Why did he not stay dead in my arms?" He meant the boy. He always meant the boy. And through it all, Russia waited. Not for reform, not for revival, but for the end. The dynasty that had ruled since the days of Rurik. The ancient bloodline that once claimed descent from Norse kings and Slavic chieftains now hung by a single thread. A father who had lost his mind and a son who could barely speak. The future had become a question mark, a void, a throne with no shadow. And in that void, chaos would soon find its voice. By the final years of his reign, Ivan no longer ruled Russia. He haunted it. He still wore the crown, still gave orders, still sat upon the gilded throne like a monument carved from flesh and regret. But there was no soul left in those eyes, only the dim flicker of a man rehearsing his own legend, one gesture at a time. He grew obsessed with relics. Holy bones, fragments of saints, splinters from the true cross. He collected them not as a believer, but as a dying man trying to bribe heaven. His personal chambers became shrines layered in gold and incense, but the air inside them smelled only of decay and fear. He spent hours before icons, whispering confessions that no priest dared interrupt. Sometimes he'd laugh mid-prayer. Other times he would weep, his beard soaked with tears, striking his chest so hard that the bruises never had time to heal. He wrote letters to his dead son, dozens, hundreds, some angry, some gentle, all unanswered. He sealed them in black wax, then burned them one by one. The court watched all this with practiced neutrality. No one questioned the Tsar, not even when he ordered mass burials of birds because they brought bad omens. Not even when he accused the wind itself of carrying whispers of treason. Not even when he began sleeping fully clothed, clutching a wooden crucifix in one hand and a dagger in the other. He trusted no one, not even the church. The Patriarch of Moscow he once honored with gold and ceremony, he now mocked openly. He believed the clergy had betrayed him, diluted God's wrath, and covered sin with softness. He dismissed them as cowards in robes, men who feared hell but did not understand it. Only death, he claimed, was pure. Only death, he whispered, cannot lie. He turned to alchemists, astrologers, and charlatans, desperate to peer behind the veil. Some said he drank mercury to preserve his strength. Others claimed he had his meals tasted by 3 different men before each bite. His food was salted to the point of poison, his water boiled thrice. Yet still, he feared. Poison in his bread, daggers in the shadows, God in his nightmares. But there were still moments when the ghost flickered back into man. Sometimes he summoned jesters to perform in the middle of the night, their bells ringing through the palace like screams. He laughed too hard, always too loud. Sometimes he made them wear masks shaped like faces of Bozars he had executed. Then ordered mock trials where the guilty were always the innocent. Other times, he would speak gently to his remaining son, Fyodor. He would dress him in the Tsarevich's old robes, comb his hair like a child's, and mutter things like, "You must carry the fire, even if your hands are made of ash." But Fyodor was not made of fire, and Russia knew it. The court had begun to splinter. Factions rose in secret. Nobles whispered of succession, of alliances, of alternatives. Some suggested foreign princes. Others spoke of civil war. All waited, all watched. Because death was coming in when it came, it would not knock. And still Ivan walked the halls. Each step heavier, each breath slower. His spine hunched. His fingers twisted with arthritis. His skin yellowed from potions meant to keep him alive. He resembled a saint's corpse, poorly embalmed, clinging to life only out of spite. Yet the crown never left his head, not even as the end approached, not even as the boy he killed waited for him on the other side. It happened not in battle, nor beneath the holy domes of Moscow's cathedrals, but in a quiet chamber tucked behind thick oak doors and candle-stained walls. March 1584. A bitter wind swept through the Kremlin like a final breath held too long. Ivan had been preparing for a game of chess. He sat, wrapped in furs, despite the heat of the hearth, his thin frame hunched, the veins on his hands like roots beneath parchment skin. Across from him sat Bogdan Belsky, a loyal courtier, and the silence between them was thick with dread. On the table, a board of ivory and ebony, pieces carved like soldiers and bishops, kings and saints. Ivan studied the board for a long time. His fingers hovered over a knight, then paused. He looked up at Belsky, said nothing, and then his body jerked. No scream, no gasping, just a sudden stiffening, as if his soul had been pulled backward by invisible hands. His mouth opened, but no sound came. His eyes rolled back. Then he collapsed face first onto the board, scattering kings and pawns alike. They say the pieces clattered like bones down stone steps. Belsky cried out. Servants rushed in. A physician was summoned, though all knew what they were truly summoning was the end of an era. The Tsar was dead. And with him, something far greater had died. The line of rulers forged in blood, baptized in fire, and wrapped in prophecy. Ivan IV, the first to call himself Tsar of all the Russias, the man who turned a fragmented realm into a centralized empire, had ended not on the battlefield, but in silence, slumped over a game of kings. For days, his body lay in state. The people came in droves. Some knelt in sorrow. Others came to be sure he was truly gone. Monks chanted from dawn till dusk, but even the sacred liturgy seemed unable to touch what Ivan had become. His face, in death, was said to be serene. But some whispered that in the right light, could still see a faint red stain at the edge of his brow, like a bruise echoing the one he had given his son. The physicians found strange marks on his body, his spine crooked, unnaturally. His fingers blackened, his skin discolored. Some said poison, others said divine judgment. A few even believed he had been consumed slowly by the alchemical potions he took to defy time. But none dared speak these thoughts aloud. Not with the body still warm. On the day of the burial, black-robed priests filled the cathedral. The Tsar was laid beneath icons of saints whose names he had once uttered between executions. As the coffin descended into the earth, thunder cracked above Moscow. Birds scattered. Bells rang. And somewhere in the crowd, a woman screamed. For the people of Russia, the death of Ivan was not just the end of a man, it was the closing of a chapter written in blood. He had been both architect and arsonist, a man who crowned himself in God's name and then dared to rewrite God's will. But now he was gone, and the throne he left behind, cold, lonely, haunted by the silence of an heir whose skull had once cracked beneath a father's hand. Russia stood at the edge of a cliff, and no one knew which way the wind would blow. The Tsar was dead, but his shadow, that remained. It clung to the Kremlin walls, soaked into the black stones of his Oprychnina chambers, echoed in the footsteps of trembling boyars and servants, who still expected his voice to come roaring from the next room. Even in the silence, Ivan's presence lingered, not as memory, but as warning. The crown now passed to Fyodor, the gentle one, the surviving son, a man whose spirit had been molded by fear, not fire. Fyodor Ivanovich was no tyrant, but neither was he a ruler. He prayed more than he spoke. He spent his hours walking monastery gardens, reciting psalms, avoiding the eyes of the men who once bowed to his father with clenched teeth. He was crowned Tsar in title. Yes, but the weight of power settled elsewhere. And so Russia was ruled, not by Fyodor, but by whispers. Real authority fell to Boris Godunov, Fyodor's brother-in-law, a calculating statesman cloaked in patience. Boris knew Russia needed more than prayers. He had seen the carnage, had cleaned the blood from the stones, had bowed when Ivan's fury tore through the court like a storm. And now he stepped carefully, like a man walking across a frozen lake that could crack at any moment. The realm teetered. Outside the palaces and churches, the people starved. The famines grew worse. Fields lay fallow. Rivers choked with corpses. Towns vanished. One by one, nobles fled their estates or turned to private armies to protect their holdings. There were rumors of cannibalism in the north, a plague in the east, of entire villages that simply disappeared. And still Fyodor rang the church bells. Every morning, clang, 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 as if trying to wake a god who had stopped listening. And beneath it all, a question began to rise, like smoke from a hidden fire. What if Ivan had not died? What if he still walked among them? Some peasants claimed they saw him, cloaked in black, face veiled, walking through forests at dusk, whispering to the wind. Others said he had returned as judgment, as wrath made flesh. After all, had he not once disappeared for months during the Oprychnina and reappeared like a ghost with a crown? Now, his death felt no different. This was how Russia began to lose its shape. Not in a war, not in fire, but in doubt. Fyodor produced no heir. His body, weak and sickly, would not give life. And so, the bloodline of Rurik, ancient unbroken for 7 centuries, began to flicker. Dynasty, in the eyes of the people, had been a divine chain, a sacred line from God to king to soil. But now the chain was rusting. And with each year, each failed harvest, each silent prayer from a Tsar too gentle for his throne, the people began to believe that Russia had been abandoned by its rulers, by its saints, by its very soul. And in the vacuum left behind, something terrible stirred. They called it the time of troubles, though troubles was far too gentle a word. It would be a time of impostors and betrayals, of false heirs and starving children, of Poles in the Kremlin and Russians murdering Russians by the thousands. It would be a time when the land cried out for order, any order, even if it came from liars or devils. And at the heart of it all, a throne once drenched in blood, a son lost forever, and the whisper of a father's name, Ivan. The time of troubles did not begin with war, began with a whisper. A single voice in a village near the Dnieper River claimed to have seen a man, tall, gaunt, eyes like winter, who said he was not dead. He said he was the true Tsarevich, Dmitry Ivanovich, the youngest son of Ivan the Terrible, the child who had supposedly died in Uglik, throat slit, buried beneath lies and politics. But now he had returned. At first, few believed it. Dmitry was a boy when he died. No witnesses, no trial. Only a pool of blood and the silence of a royal court too terrified to ask questions. His mother had been exiled, his body buried hastily, his name scrubbed from the annals of succession, but wounds fester when left untended. And now, years later, here stood a man claiming the impossible, that he had escaped assassination, that he had been raised in secret, that he had watched from the shadows as his brother ruled, and his father's legacy withered. He said he had returned not for revenge, but for Russia. And Russia listened. Because hope is a dangerous thing in desperate times. The man who history now remembers as the first false. Dmitri was cunning, charismatic. He wore the mannerisms of a prince-like second skin, spoke Latin and Polish fluently, and carried himself with the confidence of someone not merely impersonating royalty, but becoming it. He gathered supporters. Discontent, nobles, Cossacks, Polish adventurers. Even Jesuits whispered blessings over his campaign, hoping to bend the Orthodox East toward Rome. He marched on Moscow. Not as a conqueror, but as a lost son, the prodigal heir returned to mend a broken land. And astonishingly, it worked. Fieda, the real Tsar, had died. Boris Godunov, the power behind the throne, fell ill under the weight of famine, rumors, and guilt. In 1605, he died. Some say poisoned, others say broken by grief. Within months, the false Dmitri entered Moscow. He was crowned Tsar. The people wept in the streets. They cried out that justice had returned, that Ivan's bloodline had been restored, that perhaps, after all the horror, Russia had been forgiven. But ghosts do not forgive, and neither did the boyars. They never trusted Dmitri, not truly. His foreign advisors, his Polish guards, his leniency toward Catholicism, all poisoned the fragile loyalty he had built. And less than a year after his coronation, the court rose against him. They dragged him from his chambers, threw him from a window, shot him as he lay broken on the ground, then burned his body, stuffed it with gunpowder, and exploded it in Red Square. A final act of vengeance not against the man, but the memory of what he represented. That power could be stolen, not inherited, but Russia was not saved. Because one ghost begets another. And soon, another Dmitri rose. Then another. And another. 3 more men would claim the same name, each appearing from nowhere, each swearing they were the true son of Ivan the Terrible. Some led armies. Others merely stirred the minds of peasants too hungry to care if the crown was real. So long as it brought bread, Russia fractured. Entire cities switched allegiance like wind-swept leaves. Foreign armies crossed the borders. The Poles entered Moscow. The Kremlin burned. The land choked on war and lies, and no one, not nobles, not priests, not peasants, could say with certainty who ruled them anymore. Was it Dmitri? Was it the devil? Was it Ivan himself, returned to finish what he had started? Because sometimes, when a throne is built on blood, the dead never truly leave it. There are times in a nation's story when history stops speaking in words and begins to howl. This was one of those times. By 1610, Russia was no longer a nation. It was a carcass picked by crows in royal robes. Armies wandered through its fields, not in battle formation, but like scavengers. Poles, Swedes, Cossacks, even Mongols once thought extinguished. Entire towns pledged allegiance to 3 kings in the same month. No border was secure, no church safe, no crown respected. The Kremlin had been seized by foreigners. For the first time in its history, Moscow, the Holy Mother, the Third Rome, knelt beneath a crown that was not Russian. The boyars, ever pragmatic, had even invited a Polish prince to rule. So desperate were they for order, for food, for something to end the screams. But the people had not forgotten Ivan. They remembered the iron, the fire, the law, however cruel, that once held back the dark. Some whispered that they would trade all the lies of peace for one day of his wrath, that they would rather burn beneath a tyrant than drown in chaos. Some began to say it aloud. And so the priests turned to prophecy. In hushed voices, they read from the black psalters, texts older than the state itself, hidden in monasteries, untouched by war. One spoke of the Blood King who would strangle his future and birth false heirs from the underworld. Another told of the childless throne, and how Russia would suffer until a mirror of the murdered son appeared. Not true flesh, but shadow made flesh. Was this not the age foretold? A time when the father kills the son, and the son returns wearing the father's crimes like a crown. Some pointed to the impostor Dmitris. Others looked deeper. They said Ivan had never died, that he had become something other. A spirit of vengeance rooted in the land itself, cursing those who sat upon the throne unworthy. That every famine, every uprising, every blasphemous coronation was the Tsar's judgment. That the sins of the father would echo until the soil itself bled. And in that madness, even the clergy faltered, while churches were sacked. Relics stolen or destroyed. Icons wept blood, or so the stories claimed. Some monks retreated into forests, declaring that Judgment Day had already come and Russia was left behind. The bells of Moscow rang not for worship, but warning. Dmitri had returned, and returned, and returned again. Each time a lie, and each time a mirror to the horror Ivan had birthed in one terrible moment, the murder of his own son. It was as if that single act had split time, had cracked the very foundation of royal legitimacy. What is a kingdom, after all, when its father devours its heir? Not a nation. A grave, a throne of ash and bone. Yet, even in ruin, something stirred. Beneath the blackened skies, beyond the burned villages, amidst the mass graves and mass lies, whispers of salvation began to bloom like frost-bitten lilies, small, fragile, defiant. Somewhere in the cold, a spark. But for now, Russia remained in the grip of silence, and in that silence, Ivan watched. In the winter of 1613, Russia was a corpse still breathing. The impostors had been buried, the foreigners driven out, but the throne stood empty. The Rurikids were gone. Every branch of Ivan's bloodline, withered, murdered, or lost to madness. The royal crypts beneath the Kremlin lay silent, filled with names no longer whispered in reverence, but in fear. And so, for the first time in nearly 800 years, Russia faced a choice: crown a stranger or let the state collapse. The boyars gathered. Some wanted a foreign prince, others a strong general. Some spoke of restoring the false Dmitris, if only to stop the bleeding. But in the shadows of this shattered realm stood a name few had considered: Romanov, Michael Romanov. Just 16 years old. Not a soldier, not a priest. Barely more than a frightened child hiding in a monastery with his mother when the delegation arrived. They found him cloaked, not in velvet, but in soot, praying, crying, terrified. And yet they bowed. They told him he had been chosen. Not by them, they said. Not even by God, but by the people. The starving, broken survivors of Ivan's long nightmare. They didn't want a warrior. They didn't want a prophet. They wanted silence, order, a child with no history of murder, a name untouched by the curse of the Rurik throne. Michael wept. He refused. He fell to his knees and begged them to leave. His mother, the iron-hearted nun Martha, slapped the fear from him with holy force, reminding him that duty did not wait for courage. Russia had called, and though its voice was hoarse and cracked, it was still the voice of a homeland. So Michael Romanov accepted the crown. In that moment, the dynasty of Ivan the Terrible died. Not with a sword, not with poison, but with a prayer whispered by a boy who never wanted to rule. Yet fate, as ever, was watching. The Romanovs would reign for the next 300 years, through plagues, invasions, revolutions. Their reign would end in abasement, in 1918, with another Tsar's blood on the walls. But in 1613, none of that was known. All that mattered was that the long black storm of Ivan's legacy had finally passed. Or so they believed. For even as Michael was crowned, whispers persisted. that Ivan's ghost still roamed the halls of the Kremlin, that a secret child had survived, that a final heir born of sin, hidden by monks, marked by stars, would one day rise, not to save Russia, but to finish what his father had begun. These were just stories, but in Russia, stories had power. Because when a man like Ivan the Terrible lives once, the earth never quite forgets. It was late. The candles had nearly burned themselves to death. The palace was quiet. That heavy kind of quiet, the kind that presses against your ribs like a waiting hand. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen river like the voice of someone who had waited too long to be heard. Inside the chamber, Ivan paced. Not the Ivan of portraits, not the Tsar in armor or the priest-king of Orthodox legend. This was Ivan as he truly was in his final years. Gaunt, stooped, eyes ringed with sleeplessness and guilt. His beard had grown wild again, like the prophets of old, or the madmen on the city edge who screamed at the sky. In the shadows of that room stood his son, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich. The heir? The boy who had once clutched his father's robes like they were wings. The boy who had watched him execute nobles, burn villages, whip himself for sins committed and imagined. And now, that boy was a man. Tall, proud, and no longer afraid. He had come to challenge his father, not with weapons, not with armies. With words, he had defended his pregnant wife, whom Ivan had beaten in a rage. He had cursed the oprichniki, the wolves his father had raised to feed on the flesh of Russia. He had called his father old, mad, a relic drowning the future in blood. And for a moment, Ivan had simply stared at him, as if looking at a ghost wearing his own youth-like stolen clothing. Then came the blow. Not premeditated, not royal, just a man, striking his son. A metal-tipped staff swung in fury. It cracked the boy's skull. The Tsarevich fell. Blood, there is always blood in Ivan's story. At first, the silence was complete. Time itself seemed to pause, as if the earth refused to accept what had happened. Then, a groan, a whisper. The boy reached up, not to strike back, but to touch his father's hand. "I forgive you." The words were soft, almost lost to the stillness, but Ivan heard them. And in that moment, the world shattered. He screamed. Not as a Tsar, not as a monster. As a father, he tore his robes. He held the body of his dying son like a man drowning holds driftwood. He screamed for doctors, for monks, for God himself. He pressed cloth to the wound. He begged over and over for the boy to open his eyes, but the boy was already leaving. Some say the Tsarevich lived a few more hours, some say days. Some say he died immediately, and everything after was Ivan hallucinating in madness. But in Ivan's memory, in the only record that ever mattered to the broken thing he had become, his son died weeping, and so did he. What followed was not peace. It was not justice. It was silence. Ivan stopped speaking. His court grew fearful, not of his rage, but his stillness. The fire that had driven him for decades flickered. Even the oprichniki felt it. The monster had wounded itself and did not know how to bleed. He spent his last days in prayer, fasting, weeping before icons he no longer trusted. He begged for visions, for punishment, for release. But God did not answer. Only the memory did. Over and over, he saw it. That face, those last words. "I forgive you." The cruelest mercy ever spoken. They say he died playing chess. The Tsar who built a kingdom on bones and fire. The man whose fury could reduce cities to ash and make even nobles tremble, died seated calmly before a board of black and white squares. It was March 18, 1584. Ivan was 53 years old, though, in truth, he wore the weight of 10 lifetimes. His body had long since betrayed him, the spine twisted by pain. joints swollen and stiff, flesh pocked and stained by years of disease and penance. His hands, once steady with scepter or sword, now trembled even at rest. And yet he played, not alone. Beside him sat Bogdan Belsky, a courtier of no great note, except for being the last to see Ivan alive. The match had been routine, something to distract from the cold, and from the silence that had crept into the Tsar's final months like a fog. Then, without warning, Ivan slumped forward. Not violently, not theatrically, simply folded. A piece knocked from the board, a candle going out. The court panicked. Doctors were summoned, rites prepared, poison suspected. Some claimed he had been murdered, others swore it was divine judgment. The rumors bloomed like mold, that his soul had clawed its way out of his chest, that the devil himself had come to collect the debt. But the truth was simpler. He had died of everything. Of guilt, of grief, of wounds never healed and ghosts never laid to rest. No succession had been properly arranged. With Tsarevich Ivan dead, only the frail and mentally unstable Fyodor remained. Russia would soon slip into the time of troubles, and for all the blood Ivan spilled in the name of power, he left behind a kingdom destined for collapse. Yet death did not erase him, quite the opposite. For some, his passing was a relief, for others, a tragedy. But for all, a mystery. His body was dressed in ceremonial robes and buried in the royal crypt. Beneath candlelight and the chants of priests who did not dare speak his name too loudly, but what they could not bury was his presence. The walls of the Kremlin seemed colder. The bells rang heavier. And at night, servants swore they heard footsteps in the halls, uneven, dragging as if someone somewhere was still pacing in torment. And always, that moment, the image passed down not in history books, but in nightmares. A great Tsar hunched over a broken sun, the blood not yet dry, the whisper not yet gone, "I'll forgive you." Even as his flesh rotted, Ivan lived on in the soul of his country, in every tyrant who claimed necessity, in every leader who traded cruelty for control, in every shrine to power built atop human bone. He became more than a man. He became a question. Is order worth the price of innocence? Is fear a fair currency for peace? Does a nation shaped by horror ever truly heal? And so, the chessboard remains. Half played, pieces frozen. A game abandoned not because the king was checkmated, but because he refused to see the board any longer. The man is dead. The bones beneath the Kremlin have long since crumbled. The robes, the scepter, the crown, all faded. Dust upon dust. And yet, Ivan still watches. Not as a ghost, exactly, but as something deeper, something colder. He lingers in the questions we are too afraid to ask. In the silence between history's lines, in the heartbeat of every nation that has ever chosen fear over freedom. What was Ivan? A monster? Yes, undeniably, a tyrant. Without question. But was that all? Look closer. Look at the child beaten and betrayed by nobles. Look at the boy who watched his mother die screaming. Look at the young Tsar who tried at first to be just, who dreamed of law, of order, of greatness for a fractured land. And look at how those dreams were shattered, again and again, until the only thing left was fire. We want history to be clean, to offer villains we can hate and heroes we can worship. But Ivan refuses this. He is not clean. He is not safe. He is true. He shows us what happens when trauma goes unhealed, when fear is mistaken for loyalty, when we justify the unthinkable in the name of survival. He shows us what power becomes when wielded without mercy, and what a kingdom becomes when shaped by paranoia. He shows us, most of all, the fragility of legacy. Because what remains of Ivan today, a name, a painting, a story, and a skull, cracked open by his own hand when he murdered his only hope of redemption. No dynasty, no peace, no happy ending, only echoes. And so, we ask again, not of Ivan, but of ourselves. If given his pain, would we have done differently? If offered his throne, would we have resisted its temptations? If faced with chaos, would we too have chosen the lash over the law? Because the terrible truth is this: Ivan wasn't born, he was made. Forged in fire, betrayal, blood, and fear. And if we are not careful, he can be made again. The candles have gone out, the chessboard is still. But somewhere, perhaps in a palace, perhaps in a mirror, he waits. Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar who killed his son, the Tsar who might live. In us,